It was a dark Friday in Jerusalem. Clouds gathered above Golgotha, awaiting the moment that would split history in two. At the foot of 3 crosses, a Roman Centurion was carrying out orders. Another crucifixion. This time it was Jesus of Nazareth. His job was clear. Sure, Jesus died, and he did exactly that. When the 6th hour came, darkness covered all the land, lasting until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out loudly, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Then Jesus, with a loud cry, breathed his last. Suddenly the temple veil was torn in two from top to bottom, and the centurion who stood facing him said, "Truly this man was the Son of God." On that day, the life of this Roman soldier changed forever. The one charged with overseeing the execution of Jesus was shaken to the very core of his being. He went from being an executioner to a witness, from piercing Jesus' body with a spear to becoming the first Gentile to believe he was indeed the Son of God. He abandoned his high rank within the most powerful empire on earth and joined the followers of Jesus. He carried the word to distant lands, proclaiming the gospel with the zeal of someone who had witnessed everything and whose life had been transformed. Yet his tragic end entered church history under the name now remembered Longinus. Before that dark Friday, Longinus had been a Roman centurion. Centurions were legion commanders, each responsible for more than 100 soldiers. They were officers greatly admired for their discipline, courage, and effectiveness on the battlefield. His entire life had revolved around toughness, violence, and duty. To become a centurion, strength alone wasn't enough. One had to be intelligent, strategic, and above all ruthless, and Longinus was precisely that. His life was discipline, order, and blind obedience to Rome. He had witnessed death without flinching. He had executed orders without hesitation. He had become an instrument of the empire. Until that day, the city had not yet fully awakened, but already hurried footsteps echoed and hushed voices whispered a name that spread through the shadows: Jesus of Nazareth. The night before, he had been arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, betrayed by a kiss from one of his own disciples, Judas Iscariot, who sold him out for 30 pieces of silver. He was taken before the Sanhedrin, the council of chief priests, who accused him of blasphemy for declaring himself the Son of God. There, they beat him, spat on him, and condemned him, yet they lacked the power to execute him. For that, they needed Rome's approval. And so at dawn they brought him before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea. Pilate, sitting at the judgment seat, looked curiously at Jesus and asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus calmly answered, "You have said so." The chief priests and elders kept bringing accusations, but Jesus remained silent. Pilate, perplexed, leaned toward him and said, "Don't you hear everything they're accusing you of? Aren't you going to defend yourself?" Jesus said, "Nothing, not a single word." He neither justified nor defended himself. Pilate was astonished. He had seen criminals beg, lie, and weep to save their lives. But this man had an overwhelming calmness. Just then, a messenger hurriedly approached the tribunal. He brought an urgent message from Pilate's wife: "Have nothing to do with this innocent man, for I have suffered greatly today in a dream because of him." Pilate shifted restlessly. In his seat, he sensed something far greater than himself was unfolding, and he was powerless to stop it. During Passover, it was customary to release one prisoner. Pilate saw this as his chance and gave the crowd a choice: Jesus or Barabbas, a notorious criminal, a known murderer. But the priests and religious leaders stirred up the crowd to shout in anger, "Release Barabbas." Pilate raised his hands and asked, "Then what shall I do with Jesus?" The crowd roared with fury, "Crucify him." "Uneasy," Pilate asked once more, "Why? What evil has he done?" But their response was fiercer than before. "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate saw clearly that he stood powerless before the rising tide of fury. He took a basin filled with water and washed his hands before the entire crowd. "I am innocent of this righteous man's blood. His fate rests with you." Then Pilate freed Barabbas. He handed Jesus over to be crucified. The Son of God's fate was sealed. The soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium. The centurion Longinus stood firmly at the entrance, as always he had overseen dozens of punishments, he had watched many men die, but on this day, something felt distinctly different. The prisoner before them offered no resistance. He didn't scream, he didn't curse, he didn't beg. He endured each blow as if he knew it was necessary. The soldiers, cruelly amused, stripped him of his clothing. They bound him tightly to a pillar and began to whip him mercilessly. The whip fell again and again, tearing flesh without pity. Yet even then he did not cry out. Longinus watched, arms crossed, his face carved by years of violence, yet something in his eyes had begun to shift. The other soldiers mocked him. They placed a purple robe around his shoulders, twisted a crown of thorns, and drove it onto his head. Blood streamed down his face, yet his eyes remained open, steady, calm. They placed a stick in his hands as if it were a scepter, knelt before him and laughed, shouting mockingly, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Longinus did not join in their mockery. He only watched, and for the first time in years he felt uneasy. Not because of the violence, but because of the dignity of this beaten man. They spat on him, struck him repeatedly on the head with the stick. Finally, when they tired of their cruel game, they tore off the robe, dressed him again in his own clothes, and prepared him for crucifixion. But Longinus could not look away. Something within him, still asleep, began to stir. He couldn't understand why this man did not defend himself. He couldn't understand why, in the midst of humiliation, there was no hatred in his face, only profound compassion. While others laughed, he began to question who truly was this man. He didn't know yet, but very soon he would, because on that day Longinus would witness the greatest act of love the world had ever known, and from then on his life would never be the same. The soldiers took hold of Jesus, pushing him out of the torium, and onto his shoulders they placed a rough, heavy cross already stained by the histories of other condemned men. The path toward Golgotha had begun. The Centurion, Longinus, marched at the front, clearing the way through the crowd. It was his duty to lead the prisoner to the place of crucifixion. Golgotha, the hill of skulls where those Rome wished to forget were sent to die. Jesus moved forward. Amid shouts, some spat upon him, others hurled insults, yet there were also those who silently wept in the midst of the crowd. His mother Mary desperately sought him with her eyes. She couldn't see him, so she turned to the disciple John. "John, help me, take me to my son." Together they pushed through the crowd, but suddenly a soldier shoved Jesus violently. His weakened body collapsed onto the stones. It was the first time he fell. Jesus fell, and the cross crashed down on top of him. Soldiers struck him again, yelling fiercely, "Get up!" With a painful effort, Jesus slowly rose once more. Mary and John reached him just as Jesus fell. A second time, Mary could no longer hold back. She rushed to his side, knelt beside him, hands trembling and eyes filled with sorrow. In a broken voice she whispered, "I am here." Jesus lifted his blooded face and softly replied, "You see, Mother, I make all things new." It was not a phrase of comfort. It was a living prophecy of what was about to unfold. The heavy cross pressed into his wounded back, his body already beginning to give way, and Jesus fell once again. The soldiers whipped him to force him up, but he could not rise. His knees no longer responded. Longinus watched closely. He had seen it before. Men defeated men, broken, but Jesus, he wasn't defeated. There was something within him that couldn't be broken. Then Longinus, the Centurion, grabbed a man from the countryside who was passing by and commanded him, "You there, pick up that cross." Slowly Jesus raised himself. His eyes sought those of the stranger, and though exhausted, he gave a glance filled with gratitude as the procession continued. Simon helped Jesus carry his cross. A death march moved through the streets, witnessed by the city. Women wept, openly bleeding and weary. Jesus turned towards them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep instead for yourselves and for your children." Longinus heard those words, and once again something shook deep within him. Who was this man who, even on the brink of collapse, could think about others? At last they came to Golgotha, a dry, desolate hill reserved for horror. The 3 crosses were already prepared, and the soldiers began their work. Jesus did not struggle. He did not curse or resist. He stretched out his arms as though willingly offering his body as if surrendering himself freely, then came. The moment one soldier held down his arm, another raised the hammer. A cry sank. Into the heavens Mary shuddered. John looked away. The crowd murmured at every blow of the hammer. Some wept, others continued mocking, and Longinus stood there motionless when the three men were crucified. Jesus in the center, a criminal. On each side, the soldiers struggled to raise the crosses upright. The wooden post sank into its hole with a heavy thud, and Jesus' body shook violently. From the impact, the criminals crucified alongside Jesus screamed. One of them glared contemptuously at Jesus and shouted, "Aren't you supposed to be the Christ? Then save yourself and save us too." But the other criminal, weakly yet with sincerity in his voice, rebuked the first and said, "Don't you even fear God, seeing that you're under the same sentence? We deserve our punishment. We're getting what our deeds deserve. But this man, he has done nothing wrong." Then he turned toward Jesus and whispered, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replied with a promise whose echo would resonate throughout eternity, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." Longinus, watching from his post, couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had witnessed many executions, but he'd never seen anyone like Jesus. Time passed, but the world itself seemed to stand still. The sunlight faded, and a veil of darkness covered the whole land. Longinus stood watch, his eyes fixed upon him. Jesus, hanging upon the cross, still spoke, but his words weren't cries of pain. They were of forgiveness. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." A shiver ran through Longinus's chest. Forgiveness for those who whipped him, for those who nailed him down, for those who mocked him, even for him. In the distance, thunder began to roll. A storm was approaching. Caiaphas, satisfied, left alongside the other religious leaders, but Mary remained, their heart broken with grief, while John gently held her close. In a weak yet a clear voice, Jesus spoke, "Woman, behold your son." Then turning to John, he said, "Behold your mother." Jesus' body began to falter, and suddenly, with a cry that shattered the silence, he called out to heaven, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Some nearby thought he was calling for Elijah. They believed he was pleading for heavenly intervention, that the prophet himself would come to rescue him. One bystander ran, soaked a sponge with vinegar, placed it on a reed, and raised it to Jesus' lips. But Jesus did not drink. He refused comfort. His sacrifice had to be complete. A solemn silence fell upon the scene. Jesus lifted up his gaze, knowing the end was near. Then, gathering every last bit of strength within, he cried out, "It is finished." Heaven held its breath, and for the last time, Jesus raised his eyes to the sky and said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." With those words he bowed his head and died. Suddenly the earth answered. At that very moment, the ground beneath everyone's feet began to quake. A violent earthquake shook Jerusalem. Rocks split apart, tombs fell open, and the temple veil tore in two from top to bottom. The crowd fell. Silent faces that once mocked now filled with terror. Many began beating their chests, realizing what they had done. Then the Centurion Longinus dropped to his knees. Words escaped from his lips before he could stop them, and with a trembling voice he declared openly, "Truly this man was the Son of God." The Centurion who oversaw his crucifixion became the first Gentile to publicly acknowledge the crucified Christ. And then silence fell like a shroud over Golgotha. Jesus' body hung lifeless. The soldiers, disturbed by the growing unrest, began to withdraw. The crowd, confused and fearful, scattered. It was preparation day for the Passover, and Jewish custom demanded that no bodies remain on the crosses during the Sabbath. So they went to Pilate, requesting that the legs of the condemned be broken to hasten their deaths. The order was passed to the Centurion Longinus, and he gave the command without hesitation. The soldiers grabbed a heavy iron bar, approached the thieves crucified alongside Jesus, and shattered their legs. Longinus knew that Jesus was already dead, yet it was his duty to verify it. It was Roman law, so Longinus took up his spear, moved toward the cross, and with one swift thrust pierced Jesus' side. And in that moment, blood and water flowed out. The evangelist John, who was standing There would later solemnly write, "And he who saw it bore witness, and his testimony is true." Longinus gazed at the wound and then at his spear stained. With that pure blood unknowingly he had just witnessed the fulfillment of the prophecy, "They will look upon him whom they have pierced." It was a symbol blood. To redeem water, to purify the blood fell upon his face, and tradition tells that his eyes had been suffering from an ailment that clouded his vision, yet as soon as that sacred mixture touched his eyes, his sight was restored right there, at the foot of the cross, beneath the skies still weeping. Longinus finally understood. He understood that he hadn't executed a rebel. He had thrust his spear into the body of the Son of God. He fell to his knees once again, but this time as a believer. The Holy Scriptures don't detail every moment that followed, yet church tradition and various ancient writings recount what came next. Longinus, shaken and disturbed by what he had witnessed, could not simply return to the camp as if nothing had happened. For days sleep eluded him. The image of Christ hanging from the cross, silent and still, haunted him like a fire that refused to die out. He could no longer follow orders without wondering if he was serving truth or a blind empire. After the crucifixion, rumors began swirling through Jerusalem, whispers that Jesus' tomb had been found empty. Some spoke of visions and encounters with the very man he had watched die that day. Upon the cross, the Centurion listened in silence, yet every word reached deep within, igniting something new in his heart. In the depth of his soul, he knew it was no lie. Something within him whispered that death had not been the end. For days he found no peace. Images of Golgotha haunted him like a sacred fire. He remembered every word Jesus spoke, every glance, every silence, and while the world returned to its routines, he could not return to his. He could no longer be the ruthless centurion he'd been for years. His heart, forged from iron and bloodshed, began to crack when he heard the rumors that some had seen him alive. He wasn't surprised. He felt neither skepticism nor confusion, only quiet, powerful certainty. Yes, it was true. Jesus had overcome death. For the first time, Longinus began to truly understand faith. For the first time, he grasped the real burden of the cross, the miracle of forgiveness, and the mighty power of redemption. At last he understood. He resigned his position. He shed his armor, returned his sword, and, without looking back, left the Roman army. And thus began his journey of faith. He joined the disciples, sought out those who had known Jesus, and started to learn from the very one he had once executed. His name, Longinus, began to spread among the first believers. The Roman Centurion, who had led men in the name of empire, now walked barefoot, his heart ablaze, proclaiming a king whom he had once helped crucify. For years he journeyed throughout the regions of Cappadocia and Caesarea in modern-day Turkey, proclaiming the name of the one he had once crucified. "I watched him die," he would say, "yet in his death I found life." His testimony was powerful. He didn't speak from theory or hearsay. He had been there himself, and his story moved hearts. The hand that once wielded the sword now courageously raised the word of the gospel. There, Longinus preached the good news, and many believed because he wasn't just any preacher. He was the centurion who had stood at the foot of the cross. But Rome did not forgive those who turned away from its authority, and so persecution soon followed. Longinus was arrested. He was interrogated, beaten, and threatened with death. They offered him freedom in exchange for denying Christ. Yet Longinus, with the peace of one who had discovered the truth, responded with unwavering faith. Thus he was condemned. The same empire that once trained him as a soldier would now execute him as a traitor. They took him outside the city, and there atop a lonely hill he was beheaded. Longinus died as a martyr, not in fear, but with eyes lifted upward, mirroring the one he had watched raise his gaze on the cross and say, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." His body was buried in the region of Cappadocia, and soon local Christians began venerating him as a saint. Many claimed that miracles and healing occurred at his tomb, and his name became known not as an executioner, but as a witness, as a believer, as a martyr. And so, through the passing centuries, the church recognized him as a saint, St. Longus, the one who saw, the one who believed, the one who died for him, who first died for him. Yet he wasn't alone. You must learn about Peter, John, James, Andrew, Philip, Thomas, Bartholomew, Matthew, Simon, Thaddeus, and James. From the streets of Jerusalem to the far corners of the earth, these 12 men carried a message powerful enough to challenge kings, tear down temples, and split history itself in two. They had no army, no swords, no political alliances. All they had was the faith in what they'd seen and their own testimony. You have to see the video appearing on screen, the movie Apostles. This is not just the story of the church, it's the story of how 12 men stood up against the most powerful empire in history and conquered the entire world using only their faith and the sacrifices they made along the way.